lesson is about literary terms. First, let's start with plot, or the events of a narrative. A narrative can be a story, a novel, or a poem, or any other type of story-like writing. When we're determining the plot, it's most helpful to start with conflict. Conflict is the struggle between two opposing forces in a narrative. Internal conflict is between a character and him or herself. External conflict is between a character and another character, or society, or nature. In other words, internal conflict occurs when a character has trouble with themselves. They can't make a decision, they don't know what to do. External conflict is when a character comes in conflict with something outside of themselves. When making a plot diagram, I find it most helpful to start with the climax after I found my conflict, because the climax is the turning point of the story and should feature the parties involved in the conflict. So I typically list my conflict under my plot diagram in a circle, like you see on the screen, to keep track of my conflict as I label everything else. Then I go back to the beginning. The exposition is the setup of the story or background information. Pay attention to these next slides. If there's a star by the term, it means that a story does not always have one. Stories do not always give us background. Sometimes they start in the middle of the action. Rising action is always in a story. It is the events that lead up to the plot and climax. However, rising action may be long or short depending on the story. Falling action is the events that take place after the climax. Not all stories have falling action. Some leave us hanging at the main event. Resolution is the end material in which events are brought to a close. Stories do not always have to have a resolution, as authors may want to leave you thinking or guessing. Two other plot-related terms to talk about are foreshadowing and flashback. Foreshadowing is a warning or indication of future events in the story. It happens sometime in the plot. Flashback is when a scene is inserted into a story about an event that takes place before the main action, something that has happened to a character or has happened in the past before. Setting has two elements, and my students often forget to list both. Setting is both the time and place of a story. Some stories are set in the time of the 1800s. Some are set in the time of the present. Some stories are set in other countries. Some stories are set in futuristic societies. These are the places of the stories. Imagery is a word often used to describe setting, but can be used anywhere in a story. It is descriptive language appealing to the five senses. Language is not only images to be imagery. It could also be language that describes how things sound, smell, taste, touch. Any language that appears to any of your physical senses is imagery. Now let's talk about characters. There are two main types of characters we're going to talk about. One is the protagonist. It is the main character in a story. The protagonist is not always the good guy. In fact, many modern stories are told from the perspective of the bad guy, who is the protagonist. The protagonist is simply the character the story follows. The antagonist is the character, person, event, or thing in conflict with the main character. This might be the protagonist themselves. This could be another character. This could be a natural disaster. It could be anything that comes in conflict with our protagonist. When we talk about stories, we have to talk about the point of view they are told from. It's the perspective from which the story is told. There are three types of point of view, and one of those is split, so there are 4 types total. First-person point of view is when a character in the narrative is telling the story. If you've ever read the Twilight series or the Hunger Games series or heard the song I Love It or I Can't Change, those are all written from a first-person perspective. Second person is when the narrator directly addresses the reader. We don't talk much about this in English class because typically things that are written in second person are recipes or manuals, things that use you commands. Stir the gravy. Take part A and attach to part B are all examples of second person narration. Third person narration has two types. The first is omniscient narration, a narrator who knows all and tells the story. Sometimes we call this the God narrator because they know everything a god would. Examples are the Game of Thrones series, which is told from multiple character perspectives, or fairy tales often have an omniscient narrator who knows everything that is going on in the kingdom in a far, far away land. Third-person limited narrators are narrators that only know about the main characters. For example, in the Harry Potter series, we follow a small group of characters. In the song Don't Stop Believin', we only know about the small town boy and the city girl. Theme is an abstract concept explored in a literary work. Theme is often very hard for my students to understand. They use abstract nouns, things that you can't feel and touch. Themes are about guilt or jealousy or anger or love. They teach us about these things. If you're struggling with theme, think about what the main conflict is trying to depict. It can't simply be something repeated. If you see a rose come up often in the story, or you see a crow show up often in a movie, these are not themes, these are motifs. Themes are abstract. They are things we can't touch, and they teach us about these abstract things. Symbols occur in real life, like these signs on the screen, as well as in literature. They're pretty much the same thing. We know when we come to a red octagon that we need to stop. In literature, a symbol is simply something that stands for something else. If I use the term symbolism, that is simply the practice of using symbols. For instance, in a story, a rose could stand for love, or a crow could stand for dark feelings, or it could be foreshadowing a murder or horrific event about to occur. Irony we'll talk about later. If you want to take notes on it already and fill out their slides, you can keep watching. Irony is an implied discrepancy between what is said and what is meant. It's the use of words to convey opposite of a literal meaning. It's a tough concept to get, and there are 3 different types. We'll talk more about it later, but here's the brief description. Verbal irony is when an author or character says one thing but means something else. It often sounds very sarcastic. Situational irony is a discrepancy between the expected and actual result. When something happens in a story that is not expected by the characters or the reader, that is situational irony. Dramatic irony is when an audience perceives something that the character in literature does not know. For instance, when we watch plays, we might know what a character's boyfriend has done in the scene before, even if they don't know.